intergenerational injustice. This raises the need for global agreements that create a new social contract between state and citizens that can act as the basis for governance reform to drive just systemic transitions and in the process strengthen the prospect for a stable climate. And this would emerge from a new social compact. So moving on to Insight 8, economic stimulus focuses primarily on growth would jeopardize the Paris Agreement. The inspiration for this insight is that an increasing number of studies provide solid evidence that there are co-benefits of climate action that is economically optimal to pursue 2 degrees C or lower of warming. In this context, the cost of renewable energy, battery electric vehicles, and other low carbon solutions has fallen dramatically. A COVID-19 recovery strategy
the world's chance to renew confidence.
Based on growth first and sustainability second, as raised by Patricia, is likely to fail the Paris Agreement, and this is our concern. Evidence suggests a primary focus on greening the economy through sustainable investments will stimulate economic activity and provide other social, environmental, and health co-benefits. On a final point, this is a universal necessity, but there are equity dimensions, and it is particularly applies to high-income countries that have resources to invest in greener solutions. So, moving on to insight number 9. Electrification in cities is pivotal for just sustainability transitions. Now, it's well established that electrification is a key enabler of decarbonisation. We're only recently waking up, really, to the fact that urban areas can act as catalysts for these processes. In this respect, urban electrification is a powerful pathway to an equitable energy transition. Now, this has a dual aspect. On the one hand, enabling populations who lack electricity to gain access. And that's very powerful. Over 1 billion people who lack electricity will benefit from stronger electrification efforts. And on the other hand, facilitating electricity as an alternative to other fuels. There are also co-benefits in terms of health and quality of life in relation to a reduction in air pollution. And in this respect, it helps align the climate adaptation and mitigation areas with the Sustainable Development Goals of Agenda 2030. Now, of course, a key aspect for successful transition requires appropriate urban design and to be the focus of attention. And in this area, the insight argues for decentralized energy systems that somehow disrupt centralized provision as it exists at present. So, last but not least, new insight 10, going to court to defend human rights can be essential climate action. This insight relates to the fact that climate litigation is emerging as a crucial tool to address human rights issues related to climate change. And underpinning climate litigation is a really interesting expansion in notions of who or what is eligible for rights in court. Examples are children, future generations, and aspects of nature such as a river. Also linked to this is who has the capacity to represent them if they cannot represent themselves. We're finding in this area that an innovative aspect of climate litigation relates to the cross-fertilization of ideas and outcomes between courts in different jurisdictions and at different levels, national and international, for example. And in all of this, courts enter as lawmakers to address climate change, given the absence of adequate climate action in other contexts. Thank you.
So thank you to all the 3 presenters for this overview. We will soon go to the Q&A, where you'll be able to get your questions answered from the 10 experts that we have here who are lead authors of the various chapters in the report. I can just say that Patricia Espinosa unfortunately could not stay with us for the full length of this webinar and had to leave for another meeting, but we will carry on and go through the Q&A. And with us here, you can see an overview here of the panelists that we have. We have research scientist Mark Zelinka, who will go through the insight on climate sensitivity, Professor Ted Schur on the insight on permafrost, Professor Trevor Keenan will go through land use change, Dr. Nidhi Nagapatla going through the insights on water stress, Dr. Katie Hayes on mental health impacts, Bangabandhu Chair Professor Joyashri Roy on the immediate responses to coronavirus pandemic, and also Professor Michelle Scobie, who will be going through the more long-term governance response to a pandemic and what we can learn from this. Researcher Eva Alfredsson at the Economics and Growth, Professor Vanessa Castan-Broto going through urban electrification, and finally Professor Otto Spijkers on the climate litigation insight. We have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'd like to start on a question that perhaps some of you can touch on, given some of the impacts we've seen or the feedbacks we're seeing in terms of wildfires, permafrost responses, etc. What are our likelihoods of achieving a 1.5 or well below 2 degrees goals? So maybe someone in inside 1 to 3, Mark, Ted, or Trevor, if you want to answer to that. I see Mark, perhaps.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi, so from the perspective of Insight 1, which was dealing with the climate sensitivity, the big insight was that we've now pretty substantially narrowed the range of likely climate sensitivity. So that's the response of global warming to a doubling of CO2. And that kind of cuts both ways. It has good news and bad news. And the good news side of it is that we, it's been shown to be pretty unlikely that these very high climate sensitivities that are suggested by some of the latest global Earth system models, in excess of 4 or 5 degrees Celsius of warming for a doubling, those have largely been ruled out. And so what that means is that, what humans do does matter, and it's not just an extremely sensitive climate such that whatever we do, the climate's going to go off and warm by an extreme amount. But on the other hand, the kind of the bad news side of it is that we've also raised the lower bound of that likelihood. So whereas before the IPCC was allowing for values as low as 1.5, between 1.5 and 2 degrees warming for a doubling, we've now shown with this as part of this new insight that those values are pretty unlikely. And so Mother Nature is not really doing us any favors in regard to the low end. So that implies that we do actually need to make some very large cuts in emissions in order to achieve these Paris goals. We can't really rely on the climate system being insensitive to CO2, which you could have in the past rested your hopes on. Maybe the climate is not that sensitive, and we can get away with kind of moderate cuts in emissions. But in fact, those very low climate sensitivities aren't very likely. And it implies that moderate cuts are going to be needed for meeting the Paris targets. Now, what exactly the cuts would need to be, in a quantitative sense, I think still remains to be established, and maybe others can comment on that.
So does anyone else want to comment on that?
Sure. This is Ted Schur from Northern Arizona University, and I was co-author on the permafrost insight, and maybe because it relates to this question about Arctic emissions, I'll follow up Mark's comments. And this insight had to do with